The last common practice related to social redefinition I wanted to talk to you about today is that as we're getting older, it's quite common for the older generation, so our parents, aunts and uncles, family friends, or grandparents, to pass on information to us. And this is information that they think will be, beneficial to us as adults. So as we're transitioning into adulthood. There are typically three types of information that the older generation passes on to us. The first is that there are certain matters that are important to us as adults, but we don't get lessons about them in childhood because they don't matter to us or it doesn't apply. We're too young because it doesn't apply to us. So, for example, if we're talking about balancing a checkbook, or other financial matters. Now, these kinds of bits of information, it's not that a kid shouldn't be exposed to maybe budgeting and saving, but they're not going to get the same quality of information. They don't need as much detail. So again, these are matters that are important to adults, but just not really beneficial to children. If I think about going back to the car example, so parents or grandparents or whoever could teach a adolescent about how to maintain a car. It's not that you can't share these experiences with children, but they're not driving these cars independently or having their own cars. So it doesn't quite fit for them. This is different than the matters that are necessary for adulthood, but unfit for kids. So here, what I'm talking about are topics that, are it's again more inappropriate for children, not on some level. So if we're talking about sex in some ways, it's not to say children shouldn't be exposed to some of those ideas. They should be at a developmentally appropriate level. But as we're getting older, we might be learning more about STIs or about protection. I think issues of consent should be discussed with kids earlier. But as we get older, those discussions are going to look different. So again, these are matters that are still important for adulthood, but it's just not quite right for children because of the sensitivity of the topic. Third, another kind of matters of history. So this is part of your family, your traditions. We know that older adults will pass on traditions, even when you're children. But children typically aren't necessarily asking why are we doing this, and they're not necessarily doing the traditions themselves. But as we get older, family wants you to carry on that tradition or ritual or whatever it may be, or maybe parts of family history, like telling you something about your family that you didn't know when you were a child. But these are things that they're like, now that you're an adult, you're carrying on our family's story, our family's heritage, our family's behaviors. So again, this is a very common practice, and you could think about this in your own life. What kinds of things did a grandma or grandpa or parent or aunt or uncle share with you that fell into one of these categories? Again, something that's really important to you, but not necessarily fit for kids. Something that's really important to you, but just wouldn't apply to kids. Something that is part of who you are and your family. So switching gears a little bit, still talking about the idea of a social transition, um, I want to bring your attention to this idea of clarity, or these ideas of clarity and continuity. And before I get into those topics, I want to start with the question of, do you feel currently like an adult? And if you do, what were the key defining moments that helped you feel like an adult? And if you don't feel like an adult, what do you think would be a key defining moments? So I'm just going to leave this for a second. I'm going to talk more after the pause, so don't go on to the next slide yet. But just think about this question. Do you feel like an adult? When I asked this question in class, There typically are a few students at least who raise their hand in response to this question of, do you feel like an adult? And this totally is a personal question in the sense that there isn't a right or wrong answer. I can't tell you if you feel like an adult or not. This is based on your feelings. More often than not, many students are saying, no, I don't feel like an adult. And we're going to revisit those specific ideas when we get to the topic of emerging adulthood. Typically, though, when we talk about these key defining moments, it might be living independently, being more financially independent. Again, whether if you experience these things or not, that could influence your response. For some people, it might be like if you're in a serious relationship, if we have somebody who is a parent. And so these are some of the common ways in which we start to define ourselves as adults. But this question of are you and when does that happen? How does that switch over? This is a question of clarity. So I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. By the way, these two topics, clarity and continuity, are going to be important to you as you do cross-cultural assignment number 2. In that assignment, it's going to ask you about questions about clarity and continuity, so just keep that in mind. Although in the assignment, there will be a prompt asking you to go back to this lecture. So, clarity. It's essentially, when are you an adolescent, when are you an adult? And in the US and in much of the world, the answer is that is not clear. And in reality, sometimes we're treated as adults, sometimes we're treated as adolescents. This is just different times by different people in different contexts. Sometimes you're with people who, again, let's say right now in your lives, but even in high school too, where people really did look at you as if you knew something, that you were maybe an authority figure. People turned to you to get advice or seek out your opinion. But certainly there were other times where it's the opposite of that, where people were downplaying what you had to say or minimizing what you had to say. In different parts of the world, individuals go through some kind of initiation ceremony. And with these initiation ceremonies, what I'm talking about here typically is that you are having some kind of experience that's welcoming you into the adult world. If you are going through an initiation ceremony within the United States, it may be the case that, you do have more clarity, you do feel more adult-like. But sometimes that's not the case because even if you go through, let's say, a religious initiation ceremony, maybe within the religious context of your life, you're older or more adult-like, but you're also in this broader society where it's not just based on your religion. And again, some people are treating you as adults, sometimes, again, different situations. But there are other places around the world where these initiation ceremonies are more clear cut and give adolescents, maybe now into adults, more clarity. So for example, if you go through an initiation ceremony where prior to the initiation ceremony you wore a red outfit and after the initiation ceremony you wore a blue outfit, then anyone in that particular society can look at you to place you. If you're wearing red, you're a child. If you're wearing blue, you're an adult. It gives people a clear idea of who you are in that society. Obviously, this is a more of a simplistic view because we could still tell age by other features than just what we're wearing. But it is more of a defining moment. So new clothing, new markings, new tattoos. Again, these are more often seen in traditional cultures in the non-Western world. We can see how this affects how we see ourselves, and it affects how other people are seeing us as well. So this is an issue of clarity. In the United States, by and large, we just don't have that. If that's good or bad, it is what it is, but we typically don't have that. You will be reflecting on these ideas again when you get to cross-cultural assignment number 2. Now, continuity is the idea of like how quickly are you going through this process of becoming an adult? How quick does this transition take place? And there are two main ways in which this process can take place. One is more gradual. So essentially, you're assuming the roles, new rights, roles, and responsibilities of adulthood bit by bit as you get older. A discontinuous approach would be, again, more sudden, not as smooth, not bit by bit. In the contemporary world, again, I'm talking about the US by and large and in other parts of the Western world, in a lot of ways we're excluded from the adult world. And so in this way, we're receiving actually little training. So as examples, I mean, some of you, if I asked how many of you took a child development class or a parenting class in high school, some of you would say yes, but not everyone. Obviously, you're taking this class now, so more prepared to talk about children and infants than maybe other students. But still, if you were having a child at this moment, like tomorrow you were going to become a parent, how many of you would feel completely prepared to jump into that role? I would argue that there are very few people who would be able to jump into that role, even if you are my age. Um, but but we don't often have formal training in those topics, and some of us have babysitting experience or other opportunities like that, but not everyone. Citizenship, you're kind of thrown into that too. At the age of 18, it's like, hey, go vote, which I totally endorse. But at the same time, like, are you prepared for that? Do you know what it means? Do you know what you're voting for? Do you know what a primary is? Things like that. We might learn a little bit about that in a government class, let's say in high school, but again, kind of just thrown into that. For a lot of people, thrown into different financial situations where, prior to being independent in college, you didn't have your own credit card or anything like that. So when you are thrown into the autonomous world of being in college, there are many students who get into some financial trouble because they open up a credit card without having financial counseling. So even though when I gave the definitions of gradual versus discontinuous at the beginning of this slide, some of you may have been thinking, well, yes, in the US, we do, assume these roles and rights and responsibilities of adulthood bit by bit, but it's more complicated than that. In some ways in the US, it is more gradual that yes, we are becoming more adult-like bit by bit. Going back to the example of driving at 16 and working at 16, but not voting until 18, not being able to drink legally until 21, that is bit by bit. But in other ways in the United States, we are pretty discontinuous because of these exclusions from the adult world. And obviously these exclusions vary from person to person and from family to family. In many traditional cultures, in some ways, life can be more simplistic, so it's easier to describe it this way. But we often see more continuity. So, as an example, if you're in a society that's a farming society, you're learning more of these skills little by little. Like your family and parents are expecting you to participate at the level of your like developmental ability. So as an example, and from a Samoan group of individuals that they were engaging in care of younger kids, like actually taking care of children at a much younger age. So you see a 6-year-old who might be feeding a 2-year-old, where in the United States, again, mainstream United States, we don't simply see that commonly. So again, this seems to be more continuous, getting into some of these adult roles at an earlier age. I'm not saying all traditional cultures are the same, because they're not, and it does depend on the actual behavior that we're, interested in. I just wanted to be clear that in the United States, again, mainstream society, there are aspects of our transition that are pretty continuous, pretty gradual, and there are aspects that are pretty discontinuous too.